of our procurement review. Can we please begin with the introduction? I'll start with the Public Accounts Committee. Deputy Gardiner, Chair of the Public Accounts Committee.
Deputy Raluca Kovac, member of the committee.
Philip Taylor, lay member.
Vijay Greer, lay member.
And we have attendance.
Helen Thompson, Deputy CNAG, standing in for Lynn Hammond.
Thank you. And would you please introduce yourself?
Richard Bell, Treasurer.
Caroline Hastings, Director of Commercial Services.
And I'm called Raphael Category Lead, working with Caroline and her team.
Thank you. We have scheduled hearing for 1.5 hours. We have numbers of questions to get through. Please, could I ask you to keep your answers short, and apologize if we interrupt you to keep on time. Any questions that we will not get around, we will send in writing. And one more apologies before we'll start. We have received your answer. Thank you for the answers, but we received it yesterday at 8 p.m. So we are not been able to review the information that was provided. So there are likely some questions we would ask that you might provide it full answer at the written response, but please just answer in the public hearing, because to make sure that we are all up to date and we are talking about the same things. So I will start with the first area of questions, and this area around risk mitigations in procurement practices. Because as we all know, the core objective of any procurement framework is to minimize the risk of fraud, corruption, and misuse of public money. In any organizations, especially in government organizations, we are particularly concerned about small and medium-sized procurement under 25 or between 25 and 100,000, where it received less scrutiny than the official tender processes, which will be required above £100,000 spent. Would you please advise how does your team identify, assess, and monitor potential fraud and corruption risks across the procurement life cycles of small and medium procurements?
I can start with that. So we actually have a process of managing risk and corruption across all of our processes. So the fact that whatever size or value it is, the same principles apply. And we regularly run reports on expenditure, and in some cases, and certainly the CNAG has done the same exercise, running reports at under 25,000, so looking at to see where perhaps disaggregation of spend may be happening. So that's one indication that we would look for to determine whether we should, if there's anything of interest there that we need to raise. And certainly the CNAG has helped us with that sort of analysis. So in terms of the same rules apply, whether it's 25,000, 100,000 or over 100,000, in terms of when we're engaging with suppliers to do some due diligence checks on them to verify if they are bona fide, to make sure that they have, for certainly within the 25 to 100,000, that they have the appropriate standards. They've got the right mechanisms in place. So if we've asked for certain qualities, standards, particular ISO standards, that we make sure that they are fit for purpose and they are able to bid for the work.
Yeah, question, for example, do you have any threshold for, let's take a hypothetical scenario.
Yeah.
It's hypothetical that a company got a contract for 24,000 and after got another contract for 23,000 and the third contract for 22,000, which all of them not meeting a threshold for quotes. Do you have any threshold or any breaks within the system when the same company would get 2, 3, 4, 5 contracts under 24,999 that you would review what's happening?
That would have to be a manual process. So the system doesn't automatically flag. So we'd be looking at spend analysis through SAP.
So basically, there is no way to know that maybe the same company will get basically.
No, there is, but it's a manual process. It means somebody would have to go through and check. So we can look at aggregate spend.
So I guess the question is there a process to trigger that manual process?
So there is a breaches and exemption process.
There is, yeah.
So if you were to let a contract at 24,99999, and you subsequently extended that contract,
No, not extended. Like you have 3 contracts and they're on 3 different parts of the jobs that would be required because they're completely 3 different jobs, but it's the
well,
same.
if they're completely 3 different jobs, then
The rules would apply to the 25,000.
I mean, hypothetically, you have
I
kitchen.
have danger of my minister answering a hypothetical question, not reasonably, but
No, but let's say, so basically, if I understood correct, there is no automatic trigger that will raise a flag that there is a company that continued accumulate spending with bids under 25,999.
so
Is it correct?
so the risk becomes, if they deliver those contracts for 24,999, that risk is far reduced. If they extended, so they gained the work at 24,999, but subsequently on that particular contract went above that, then there is a requirement for the people, for the department, or in the case of corporate contracts, the Treasury to go through an exemption and breach process. You started to see a pattern emerging by reviewing breaches and exemptions.
No, I
log,
understand, yeah.
then you would start to see that a particular entity or a particular department, for example, had a proliferation of exemptions or breaches that were caused by extending contracts beyond the
24.99.
limit for which they were first getting them. So
Was
that's the process you would see. If, however, a supplier was quoting whatever that number was, and fulfilling those contracts in different departments, that's not the same risk as getting the work on one threshold and then extending beyond that.
But if it would be this within the same department on similar types of jobs, same company getting the same similar contracts and actually others not receiving a telephone call, how would you deal with it?
How would I deal with it if they delivered a contract for 24,999?
Okay, so it's basically if they deliver contract
Yeah.
for 24.99 and it doesn't matter how many contracts they deliver for 24.99, it's within the
If
framework.
they were disaggregating contracts, then that's a different matter. If, however, they were delivering wholly different, and this is a hypothetical, and
Absolutely.
I'm not sure how often this hypothetical has ever come up in my experience. It's more likely, but still not overly significantly happening, that someone gains a contract when that tender, or when the department has asked for, 3 quotes, because it's between 25
And 100,000.
and 100, and that they then exceed the upper threshold, which would have meant that they should have.
Tendered.
No,
Got it.
this completely
So
I'm
that's a
talking about.
different scenario. Yeah.
Yes, Phil.
And deliberately playing boundary creep, if I can call it that. Yeah.
You split the job to get multiple 24.99 with the same contractor for similarly the same job but different bits in the same job.
Yeah, we don't see a lot of evidence for the same. Well, I would say, in that case, they are broadly the same contract, and they've gone above the threshold,
And therefore
and
they
that
should be
therefore they're
doing.
captured by the. They should.
How
be
you can-
captured
How
by
do you
the
identify
exemption.
that?
How would you identify that?
If-
It's for the. What do we call them? Who's the
Yeah.
person responsible for the
The-
actual spend?
The accountable officer
The accountable officer or their team
to
to
highlight.
file a breach or an exemption for having not let the contract in the first place. At the right
For
time.
having deliberately, perhaps in this hypothetical situation, bid low or gone in low and then been given more work.
So you've got no examples that you can think of where someone has bid low and deliberately bid low, below a threshold, and then build more?
Well, can we just clarify here as well?
I think we're talking about two
okay?
different things now.
The estimated contract value is the responsibility of the department that lets it.
Yes.
If the estimate is at less than, I keep getting my thresholds wrong, at less than 25, that is
It's a
one
single
quote,
quote, yeah.
right? If the department has estimated that it's over 100,000, then it needs to go to full tender.
Yeah.
If a company bids 24,999, that's sort of irrelevant in that the full tender process would have been undertaken. If a department subsequently awarded it, and in this case it would be 99,999 to that particular entity, then they would require, and then the costs exceeded the £100,000, then they would be required to fulfil a procurement exemption or breach.
I have a question. For example, the contract was 24,999 and contract gone into 35,000. Would they need to? Would they be required to submit the breach of contract?
Wouldn't be a breach of contract, it'd be a breach.
Oh, a breach of
Threshold.
Yeah.
would be a breach. So would they submit the breach of threshold?
Not the supplier.
Not the supplier, department.
No,
Yeah, the department.
department should be notifying by breach that it's exceeded the.
And this is how it came to you. This is where you will see these breaches.
Yes.
Centrally. Okay, let's move on. What extra safeguards, if any, are you useful in mid-value procurement where the local small and medium businesses often face the most hurdles? Because this was the submissions from small and medium businesses that they feel that there is a white list that they cannot get through. It might be perception. I'm not telling it's anecdotal. I'm not telling it's correct, but there is a perception. So it's very difficult to argue with the perception of the small and medium businesses. Now, how we can ensure then what are extra safeguards we do have in place that helping them to get through the hurdles and engage and deliver work for the government.
So,
Well, I'll give Caroline a bit of think time.
Yeah.
First and foremost, of course, if we're talking about small and medium-sized entities, small and medium-sized entities are more likely than perhaps big four consultancies to be looking for work at either less than 25,000 or less than 100,000, which is therefore a lower hurdle in terms of quotes as opposed to full tendering processes. I would, however, say, and it used to happen and we've started it more now, the importance here in terms of businesses being aware of what the work is fed by improved engagement with local businesses so they can see the work coming. So this is a common thing that goes throughout. If commercial services don't understand the department's pipeline of work, then we end up with bottlenecks, we end up with frustration, we end up with departments and commercial services not perhaps being 100% aligned. Similarly, between commercial services and the department, if suppliers don't see what the pipeline of work is, and if they don't even know what the work is, then they won't know how to go about bidding, and they won't know how to go about preparing to gear themselves up, perhaps in partnership with other entities or other companies.
Can you
to
give
get
me
that work.
an example engagement that were with small and medium businesses to explain, to train, to prepare them over the last year?
yeah, so I can pick that one up. So pipeline, as Richard has alluded to, is the most important thing, and that's one of the areas that we're building, we're working on to build out. So this is a pipeline of things that we know either contracts are coming to an end or we are understanding that departments will require certain things. So we want to be able to publish a pipeline so that small and medium, particularly small and medium suppliers, excuse me, can actually start to prepare and start to position themselves in a place where they can bid and make themselves familiar with the type of work that we will be looking for in the future.
No, I understand. What has been done during the last year from the engagement point of view with small and medium businesses?
So,
Practically, kind of.
okay, practically, I personally have met with a number of particular providers.
Did
and
you reach
Paul and
out to them or they reach out to you?
I've reached out to them and they have reached out to me or to us. So I've had a number of discussions with the likes of Tony Merritt from Digital Jersey, who's been outlining some of the challenges that sector faces. I've sat with the Construction Hub, which I'm a member of now, and met with some of the local building companies in terms of at the moment the emphasis is upon them to work with large companies in the UK. They would like the opportunity to actually lead the opportunity and for them to partner with people in the UK. So these are the discussions that we are having. They're early days, but
So there is no still plan in place like in engagement that happen in quarterly base in specific place
well,
where that you can update the
that is building.
industries.
Yeah, no, that is building. And certainly the Construction Hub is a regular meeting. The digital investment, I can't remember the exact title, digital,
I'll talk about the RFI process
Yes.
for M&D.
yeah. So
Okay.
we met at the industry event with digital services where we had 40 plus local suppliers coming to hear about the pipeline of work that was going to be launched into tenders and quotations.
So basically, is it anywhere on the gov.ge I can go and as a
Not
established
yet.
business said, okay, I would like to hear from the government about the pipeline. These days, twice a year or 3 times a year, we'll be meeting at this place to kind of update. It's nothing, not yet,
It's
not yet.
Not yet.
I
But that is
understand.
the plan. And these initial meetings with these groups, and it is very early days.
I understand. No, it's really good.
Is that we want to build that rapport and actually be more aware of what they can offer, because that's mutually beneficial for us when we're looking at our requirements and when the business is looking at the opportunities, and it's also good for them in terms of maybe positioning themselves to be in a position to bid.
And thank you. When the urgent work or unexpected work is coming in, obviously the traditional processes cannot work. How do you mitigate risks such as price inflation or conflict of interest in emergency procurements?
What do you mean by an emergency procurement in your?
Got an example of an emergency?
Yeah.
I mean, we had during the COVID, it would be emergency procurement, something that you need to procure straight away. You cannot go through the traditional. What are the framework for the emergency procurement to ensure that it's no price inflation?
So having had to sign off on most of those, so we're talking about pandemic level of emergency as opposed to...
Sinkhole would be a better example.
Sinkhole, good example.
Sinkhole.
Sinkhole.
Thank you.
That's the best I can think of quickly.
Okay.
Is
So,
this
sinkhole, big hole in the road's got to
This
be
is
fixed.
Rouge, yeah? Is that what you're thinking?
Any
as an actual example?
sinkhole on
Any-
Victoria
yes.
Avenue
Okay.
tomorrow, that will not happen.
Well, in an emergency, there's certain checks and balances you would need to put into place, but you would need to know cost estimates and have an understanding of what those costs would have been in a normal situation.
Do you have it within PFM? Do you have it as a framework? Do you have as a guidance, emergency procurement, anything that is structured?
So, answering this
Paul.
question from the perspective of infrastructure department, sea defences, for example, they have frameworks or contracts
Yes,
in
they do,
place,
yeah.
already in place
Place.
for the provision of materials, if I can put it that way. Materials are generally the thing you need to fill sinkholes with, and they will go to those existing framework contract holders. Yeah?
Yes, they do, yeah.
But it's nothing centrally at the commercial services that actually said, this is our framework for emergency procurement, this is the
Well,
steps that
if
you
you
need
want
to
to talk
follow.
about actual emergency in the sense of pandemic, then much of that was controlled through Caroline's predecessor and me signing off on exemptions, pretty much usually exemptions from existing
Agreements.
supply routes, and we were obviously having to investigate and look at supply routes we were always having to, we were in the normal course of business being pursuing. I think in the sense of, so that would then mean that we'd have to do risk assessment regarding those, we'd have to be doing the usual steps you'd expect, but on a, perhaps with a higher risk appetite throughout that, and at pace in order to procure those, but they were
Understand.
generally mostly signed off. In the case of sinkholes, well, sinkholes are sinkholes, but sea defences often have holes in them arising from storms, and that department will have contracts in place.
So it's within the
to call down.
department.
But when it comes to the sort of pandemic level of emergency, then yes, commercial services has a much more, has a much greater role to play in signing off on exemptions and accepting additional risk appetite, as we did throughout
Yeah.
the period of the pandemic.
Now, a couple more questions from me before we move on. In the public finance manual, you do have exemptions for the confidential contract. So I think it was written as a secret contract within, and I wasn't sure what it is. So can you please provide an examples and criteria for when exemptions might be applied for confidential contracts? Example of type of confidential / secret contracts, because it's part of PFM, a public finance manual.
I'm having a think.
I think, Caroline, we had one yesterday in respect of telecommunications within the Blue Light Service, if you recall that yesterday.
Yes. Thank you, Paul. Yeah.
And the challenge I have, and I do, Caroline, is because it was declared secret, I don't know how much I can say here and now, but that would be an example of a...
But we would like to understand what type, what are criteria that you apply and that you decided this contract is confidential, so secret.
Well, if it's of national security, then that's obviously got to be dealt with separately. So the normal rules would apply, wouldn't it? For if it's secret, then the number of people involved would be very small, and it would be signed off at a senior level.
Okay, and the last one, it's around the breaches. How do breaches occur in practice, and what are the most likely scenarios for the breaches of procurement?
Okay. Often it's where the contract has expired and there hasn't been sufficient time to retender it, which is poor planning.
It's for planning.
Poor
yeah.
planning. Emergencies, although that would also have a particular reason as to why. So we're having to breach.
And contract value.
And contract value exceeded, which is where the contract has, the contract value is more than anticipated for a number of reasons.
If you're thinking about, I think you picked up this number. How many breaches were in 2024? It's 100 something. Is it correct?
Yes, I provided the list to you. Yeah.
Yeah, because it was
Yes.
8 o'clock in the evening that I wasn't sure. So if you're thinking about 140-ish breaches that were in 2024, how would the percentage you divide? How many of them were poor management? How many of them were emergency? And how many of them exceeded the values that expected, approximately?
The majority, I haven't done the numbers on that. But I would say that the majority are overruns. So there's been insufficient time to run a full process.
So poor planning.
That's one of the key areas, yes.
And how are a department or individuals held accountable in these situations?
Well, how are they held accountable? Well, the breaches are, obviously, we then and go back to the departments. We're trying, it's not necessarily the central team's responsibility. This is the accountable officer. So there is guidance given In some instances, we support them to get back into a position where they are compliant, and we work hard to do that. It's not necessarily a deliberate act. And you've got to remember some of these teams are not doing this all of the time. So the contracts may be with one or two people, and if they're busy, they may not necessarily realise that they've gone into a breach.
So
So there's a whole range of factors there. Sorry.
the approach we would take would be more about future prevention.
Yeah.
So if we started to see a theme within a department, and it's happened in the past, where there were lots of breaches coming through, and in particular breaches, then that would be cause for a conversation to take place regarding tightening of processes at that point. If you started to see deliberate, systematic breaches on a continual basis, then I would escalate that further where that to be required.
Okay, thank you. We are moving now to
Sorry,
capability.
can I just
Sorry,
ask
yeah.
one question on that? Can you give the public some idea of what's happening to the value of these breaches over the years from, say, 2020? Have they been increasing? Have they been dropping?
Well, if you choose 2020, we would have had very high
Let's go
valuations.
2021.
Yeah, because COVID from
After
2022.
COVID, 2022, let's say.
I would have
I
to.
don't know.
I don't.
I'd have to look back
We'd
at it.
have to look back at that number.
We'll follow up with a written
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm going to ask a very basic question, for which I apologise. It's because I don't really understand. What is the difference between the responsibility of the commercial services department and the departments?
Yeah.
Who does what?
Who does what? It is a bit of a mixed picture at the moment, but generally the central team are responsible for setting policy, process, recording of so breaches and exemptions is a good example. Setting policy and procedure, so making sure that the public finance manual is up to date and in accordance with law. And we work closely with the governance team in that area, making sure that our guidance is clear and up to date and consistent. So that's our sort of policy procedure piece. And then doing corporate contracts, so where there's commonly bought items from across the government, we would look to leverage our volume, if it's a volume-based commodity, to ensure better pricing, to make it easy for people to access those contracts. So terms and conditions are agreed, and basically they're raising orders against a contract. And it would be for us to make sure it doesn't go into breach or go over the value, and if it does, to do something about it. So that's the central role in very sort of, it's much bigger than that, but you've asked me that one particular question.
So essentially, it's the accountable officers are responsible. They're the responsible for procurement, but they have to follow the guidance and advice provided by your department.
Correct.
As set out in the Public Finances Manual and any
Yeah.
other advice you might want to give, they'll be expected to follow it.
Exactly.
But when it comes to corporate contracts, who negotiates them?
If it's corporate contract, it'll be one of the team.
Okay.
Or part of the team. We would have other members of government involved, so who's going to be the main recipient, so who's going to use this the most, so key stakeholders, to ensure that we've got the definitions right, that we've got the right goods or services defined, and so it would be a collective, collaborative approach in terms of agreeing that contract. We would be responsible for monitoring usage and the relationship with the supplier or suppliers if it's a framework
Who
agreement.
signs it?
We do. Treasury.
No, so I'm not questioning whether it's
No,
right or right, I just wanted to
Treasury,
know.
yeah.
Because I'm
So that's a corporate- that's a corporate contract,
Because
yeah.
he's quite accountable, really. If my memory
So an example would be
Can I
the
ask
fuel.
clarification on that one? Can I ask clarification on that one? If a particular company or charity supplies services for 3 different departments, who is managing negotiation? Because each department has different requirement.
That depends. Are you talking about a corporate contract?
Yes.
Yes.
So
3
that-
departments,
yeah.
1 charity supplying services for 3 departments with 3 different requirements.
Well, so
So that
that sounds like that's
three contracts, yeah, that
three
sounds like,
separate contracts, each negotiated by each of those departments. If we're talking about, when we talk about corporate contracts, we're talking about, for example, supply of fuel or the managed
managed print.
photocopying, etc.,
So
where
the-
there's sufficient volume across multiple departments and of scale. If we were talking about supplying sandwiches for 3 different departments, that's not a corporate contract.
So some of the professional services contracts as well, where
Yeah.
we have, you know, what's, as it says on the tin really, but, you know, we've got contracts for advisors or people who can come in.
That's then a framework.
That's a
For
framework.
which you've done the pre-work,
Yep,
but there's still a requirement for a department to get quotes from within that framework,
correct.
which is consistent with the level of threshold of the contract that they're trying to let.
Now,
Yeah.
if I'm taking back about charity, and I have a couple in mind that work with 2 or 3 departments and they have limited resources and they need to negotiate their contract with different parts of the government on annual base.
Well, that,
For the supply of what? Give us an
yeah, I was
example
going to
of
give
what
us an
they're
example.
supplying.
Is it, are they
But they're
requiring?
supplying, for example, medical services. And they can supply across the departments, by the way. It's not always going to the health, it can go into education, it can go into the social security. Not social security, we're talking about employment, housing, whatever. So it can actually be across these 3 departments. So do this, and then what, from my understanding, they would not negotiate with your team, they will have 3 negotiations with 3 different departments.
They could do that, or they could ask us to negotiate across 3 for a
Who they?
single.
Department.
The departments.
So it depends on the departments?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it could, I suppose, theoretically, for whoever's involved in this, they might actually come to the centre and say, could this be done in a different way? You know, it's a two-way thing. So if this particular example, if they felt that they would perhaps benefit from one contract across the 3, there's no harm in coming to the centre to ask and to discuss with us if that's something that could be achieved. That's a communication issue. We're not saying we wouldn't do it.
But it's no
likewise,
clarity what's the process in this case.
Well,
There
I would
is.
say there's grey areas in between. This organisation is an incredibly complex organisation with very many, as you will have seen from the number of suppliers registered on our systems that we've provided to you. It's very clear to us where something is most definitely a corporate contract. It's very clear where it's just a department specific, and there are probably a much smaller number where you could say, is it corporate or is it not corporate? Is it a separate set of services that is being procured by one department as distinct to a set of services that are being delivered to another department? In the case of fuel or managed print, it's fairly homogeneous across, other than in terms of volume, what's being provided across those departments.
Is there an explicit value threshold for corporate contracts?
I think value would be taken into account, but not a threshold as such. So,
I suppose it would
you
be
wouldn't say if it was only by thought to value, then all of a sudden Caroline's team would be responsible directly for the procurement of, I don't know, the medicines and drugs within health. So that's clearly not a corporate contract, because it's a contract that's for the provision of HCJ. So there might be, say for example, I'm not personally in favour of having a corporate contract for sandwiches, even though sandwiches is a homogeneous project, but largely different levels of quality of sandwich. But across departments, you could say that would be a corporate contract. I'd clearly say no, that's best left. with
we
the
did actually
departments.
have an arrangement with a number of sandwich providers a long time ago. I'm going back a while now, but we just
How
had
many
a
corporate
framework.
contracts do you have?
Currently about 20.
20, yeah.
20. And they cover, you said, fuel,
Yeah, as Richard said, fuel, managed print. I'm thinking the ones that I look after: travel, secure disposal of confidential waste. So it's as Richard said, it's products and services that are used.
Janitorial
Janitorial.
supplies.
So that would be
Yeah.
another
Okay.
corporate
I'm just trying to get it
contract.
clear in my mind.
Yeah.
And the responsibility of having the contract, the central contract in place, the department draws against that contract. And
Yes.
they're responsible for making sure that the contract that particular purchase is in line with the corporate, or complies with the corporate contract.
Well,
effectively.
basically, they'll be
Yeah,
given
they just draw down
they'll
on
be
it.
given a list of products or services which sit under that agreement, and then they can draw down upon those as they see fit by raising orders.
And how well does it work?
How well does it work? I think it works reasonably well for the commonly bought, clearly defined items. There's always a bit of a grey area,
Yeah.
but yeah, and people like it because it's simple. You know, they can get things quickly, and actually there's probably scope for us to do a few more of those in different areas. It's just capacity at times.
Okay, just one final question on that. Does the contract have an overall spend for a year built in it? So, and it may be Hog Robinson overruns it, maybe I have no idea. The total value of that contract is such and such for a year.
It's not done like that.
Not quite.
No, if it's over 100,000, we will have tendered it, and therefore anything over
Okay, yeah.
So the value up to over 100,000, it would have tendered anyway.
If you take the fuel contract, there will be estimates based upon current or historic usage.
Yeah.
But obviously, if a department is using way more fuel in a particular year, then they will spend way more than.
No, I understand it's
There's
not hard. I just wanted to just trying to get a feel for it.
Yep.
And obviously, we like to try and get the estimated quantities for those types of things close, because then obviously we're getting a better price, aren't we, if we're close in terms of our value and know the volumes. So we use historic data to identify what we think typically the spend would be.
When, as you know, perhaps one of yours is probably monitoring the activities of departments in terms of compliance, shall we say. What KPIs do you use to monitor the procurement practices of departments?
We don't actually have a KPI for each of the departments, or we're more interested in monitoring the performance of our suppliers, and so we don't have a league table of
Okay, no, you've
Yeah,
answered the question. So what KPIs do you use for monitoring suppliers?
so on-time deliveries, price, making sure the prices are maintained,
Big product
delivery times,
specifications,
yeah,
service specifications. So it'll be a range.
so it'll be a basket of items that, you know, depending on the contract, obviously. Some things that it's timeliness is the most important criteria, so we'd be looking at how quickly people can deliver things. We'd be looking for price holds where we've been out to tender, so how long they're going to hold their prices for. If it's based on volume, then obviously we'd be looking at volume thresholds, and if we exceed those thresholds, then what's the implication on the contract? So it really is, there isn't really one size fits all. It depends on what you're buying and how you're buying it.
And presumably you'd have a different level of monitoring, depending on the size of the contract.
Yeah, and the risk.
Because you can't monitor thousands of contracts of less than £25,000. It'd be impossible to do it.
It would, but we'd be looking at risk as well. So obviously there'll be some contracts which are, you know, maybe lifeline, part of a lifeline service, that we'd be monitoring more closely than, say, stationery. I use stationery as my go-to.
Okay, that's right. Let's move go through further my crib sheet.
Okay.
So to what extent do you liaise directly with suppliers? Or does that depend on the size of the
It
contract?
depends on the size of the contract, and it also depends on who is the main user of the contract. So if I take I'll use INE as an example again. We have a very arm's length liaison or relationship with the suppliers. That's left with the department. The department has the technical and commercial capability of looking after those relationships. Where we're letting contracts centrally, more strategic contracts, we would have relationships with those suppliers, and it might be jointly, so working with digital services. There are some suppliers there where we would be jointly interested in the relationship and making sure that we're close and understand the service levels are being met, that the people that they're employing are meeting the standard, that they're delivering in accordance with the contract. It does depend on.
And how well do you feel it works? You're allowed to say not as well as you'd like.
No, well, it's always a challenge, isn't it? And a lot of this is about relationships as well.
Yeah.
So I would say it works reasonably well, but there are pockets where we just don't have the reach necessarily to have the close relationship that some people might expect us to have. So if I take health, for example, there's a health have got very bespoke requirements, and their relationships with NHS supply chain and others, they hold those relationships probably more than we would centrally. That's not to say we wouldn't be involved if needed.
Now then, just moving on, in terms of procurement officers, shall I call them, they're procurement officers within the departments, who's responsible for in the procurement, and also in your department as well.
Yeah, so we've got central team. There are a number of people who work within departments who are procurement specialists. If I take INE, for example, there's someone who worked for me who's now working in INE, managing some of the doing the procurement effectively at arm's length, but has a good relationship with the centre. There are other areas which, in health, I've got 2 people in health who are working in health, but they don't do all the procurement in health. They have a small portfolio.
So what sort of training does a procurement officer get? What sort of qualifications do they require? What courses are they supposed to have gone on? And
Yeah.
you can't. I couldn't go be a procurement officer. I mean, I'd be hopeless. But
So the recognised qualification is a Chartered Institute Procurement and Supply, and that's you can do that at various levels. Some of the team are currently working their way through SIPs. Doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have that qualification. Good commercial skills, other work experience in other similar environments is helpful. You do have to be numerate and understand. But you also have to understand as well the softer side in terms of talking to people around their specification and really getting to grips with what they actually want to buy. So good communication skills, good numeracy, legal, need to have some legal understanding, particularly in the buying of goods and services. So law. Have I missed anything, Paul?
No, I think your point about the softer skills, because you have an internal audience, which is my colleagues, and actually teasing out from them what specification, what they're looking for, and there is a different skill set, and it's a soft skill set, and actually talking to suppliers in understanding their interests and needs, and they're quite often quite different. So
as well,
that's
isn't
very
it? There's
good.
the commercial negotiations as well,
Yeah.
which sometimes you do have to be a bit Jekyll and Hyde, because you're wanting the best for the organisation and the best commercial
are
outcome.
there any gaps across the team that you can see? Where
We've got a relatively small team, and I'd say there are some gaps in some areas, and they are sometimes filled by external consultants.
Yeah.
We've got some in the digital area, for example, working in digital services. That's a particular skill set. Digital is one category. So I tend to look at this as categories of spend, and then what skills you need to have in those. So digital, you need to have obviously understand what's happening in the digital world. Health, you need to understand NHS, how the drug companies work.
Yep.
So you've got to be sector specific. You can be a generalist, but we also need people who are.
Do you have any key person risk? Where you have perhaps if someone leaves, you're then really stuck, or have you got a reasonably good pipeline coming through?
I would say we're light in some areas, and therefore there is a risk.
And that would be, or shouldn't you say, in these circumstances?
Well, we tend to cover, and we tend to buy in some resource,
Okay.
but there is always a chance that somebody's going to have to cover, and the central team usually cover because
Okay.
because we're experienced at doing that.
Because if someone suddenly has a heart attack and they're signed off for 3 months, you can cover that situation.
Yes, we can, and we work with the departments as well, because although they may not have official qualifications, there are some experienced people working within the departments who have good relationships with their suppliers and are managing contracts. So it's not all down to the central team.
Okay, just a couple more questions. Are suppliers happy with us? Do they like the way we treat them? Are they satisfied, or are they always dissatisfied? And
I was going to say something.
and how do you monitor that?
I suppose from a supplier perspective, if they're thinking that we're going to be, not giving them work because we've had a difficult relationship, that might determine how they behave, which is not how we see things. I think that through the surveys that I've seen, we need to do more, reaching out to the suppliers, but we are a small team. We need to work more closely with some of our colleagues who have these relationships. So I think it's a fine line.
But we also collect customer feedback.
We do, yeah.
In that sense.
And you're always trying to improve it, really.
Well, yes, and we do encourage feedback, but not everyone either has the time or wants to give you feedback. But we want feedback because that's how we can improve. And sometimes it's disappointing if something's been going on for a while and the first we hear about it is when they're very dissatisfied. But that's just something we need to work on and improve. And I think actually working more closely with the suppliers and getting to understand their pipelines and their challenges will help us, improve that where it needs to be.
Now, there'll be some contracts within a department which are still quite large, which you might not get involved with. To what extent do you get involved in monitoring the performance of a contract that you may not have any central responsibility for, because there'll be quite large spend going on some of these contracts within the department. To what extent are you able to monitor the performance of those?
Well, so we do have guidance and best practice in terms of regular reporting that should be done. So this is where we become more advisory and expect them to be able to provide information. Occasionally we will attend supply meetings, and that's generally with, perhaps it may be where a contract is not going particularly well, and that's when people ask for support, and we will obviously
more of
provide
an
that.
informal approach.
We do have guidance, don't we, Paul?
Guidance, we do provide quite
yeah.
a lot of guidance on our website for our colleagues in terms of supply and contract management, and I believe it's very good. And Caroline's right, occasionally, I speak from personal experience, when a contractor's running perhaps into some challenges, I may get asked to go and help, just to bring in that experience and expertise that Caroline's referred to in terms to resolve the issue, and generally that's quite successful. But if it's a contract that's totally managed by a department, we are not that actively involved in the day-to-day management.
No, but occasionally we go in as an independent because sometimes the difficult conversations don't want to be had with someone who they've been working with really closely for a while. So sometimes it's helpful to have someone else
Go and have a look.
go and have a conversation.
Okay, one last question. The ferry contract, of course, received a lot of attention. To what extent was your department involved in that?
So economy were responsible for being involved in dealing with that, had the relationships. We did have 4 people involved during the course of that procurement, when it was a joint procurement and when we went separately. So we had 4 people. We had law officers' involvement, had commercial involvement, we had treasury involvement and procurement.
Now, putting aside all the media stuff you read, how well do you think it went in terms of process?
I think in terms of process, we did it. It followed best practice and was very thorough.
And how was the process managed and coordinated across departments from procurement point of view?
It,
How was it managed? Yes, still with the ferry. Yeah.
oh, right.
How was it managed and coordinated across departments?
So the main department that was responsible, that had that's contract impacted, was the ports and the economy. So those are the 2 key customers, if you like, or recipients of the service. And we, from a treasury perspective, from the procurement. So those were, so it was a
more
consortium.
team-based.
Yeah, it was a,
It's more team-based than necessarily formal communication between heads of department. So the team comes together to service the particular, in this case, tender rather than a procurement, for the ferry contract. So rather than looking at boundaries between
Yeah.
the departments.
About ferry contract, it was not standard type of procurement because we didn't procure services and goods. We procure something that would be paid by, should pay by itself. When we had a public hearing, we asked what are the best practices around the world. They looked to create actually the framework for joint procurement this type. We couldn't get an answer because it wasn't. So if I'm thinking about it, as commercial services, as you mentioned, responsible for policy, procedures, contracts to create this framework, have you had an input and guidance around how you create a joint procurement tender to the economy department, or it was left to the economy department?
I think it was, well, I don't know if it was a joint agreement. We're talking about the early stages where it was a joint procurement with Guernsey and Jersey.
No, who will create in this? So to go through the procurement, because it's not standard procurement, there are other areas and places in the world that they've done this type of procurement, joint procurement between 2 jurisdictions on this type of contract. So it required to create a framework for joint procurement. So was it your department responsible, as you said, for the policy procedures to create this framework for joint procurement, or you left it with the economy department? Who was in charge to create the framework, not the procurement itself?
When you say a framework, I don't think we've created a framework because
How you
it's
do the-
relating to this particular service.
I think we're using framework in two ways here. So
Right.
the framework agreement is an agreement that's open for.
Leave the framework. How do you do
but
joint
you're
procurement of these
thinking
services?
Yes, you're asking about the procedure.
Procedure.
That we went through rather than a framework. Sorry, it's a bit, the terminology is a bit.
That doesn't matter. Framework procedure. Basically, how do you do joint
So
procurement?
how did we set ourselves up to jointly procure, is what you're asking. Well, there were some terms of reference. I'm looking to Paul
In
here.
terms of reference, there's a procurement strategy that was created by the Department of Economy, which looked to do as I understand, a joint procurement with.
So it was left with the department.
Well, the procurement strategy was then signed off by me or by the team, central team. So procurement strategies are signed off. So the actual strategy, which was how they were going to go about this, was defined. The economy team had input, and there was a procurement input, and there was commercial input. So again, it's a team effort. It's not one person deciding. It's a collective of various disciplines.
So
that came together.
why, who was responsible that it's gone wrong? So if it's collective, so it's collective responsibility?
No, ultimately the AO is accountable. They
Okay.
will have received advice.
Yeah.
And that's not me talking about the ferries in particular. Remembering this is not procurement, it's a tender for a service to islanders rather than procuring for specifically for government or for the delivery of services to government. So there is a lead, as there is with all, and the accountability rests with accountable
I
officers.
see. As you mentioned fuel,
Yeah.
and I looked into the Public Accounts Committee report on the fuel farm lease renewal back in 2016. I know that
I was
renewal.
talking about fuel, not the fuel farm.
I'll ask about the fuel farm because it's just
Okay.
associated with the fuel farm release, and I found this report. Who was responsible for renewal to run? Was it a tender process run? Is it for the renewal of the fuel farm, or who is dealing with it?
So
That's
that's INE,
INE.
Infrastructure Department.
So have you had involvement in it?
We've had some involvement.
Do you know if the Public Accounts Committee recommendations from 2016 were implemented? Like, was it a tender process? Was it a sufficient advertise of the lease? I'm just looking through the recommendations.
So they
Please.
took advice and extended the existing arrangement.
So it was no advertising for lease coming for renewal, and it was no tender process. Okay.
Yep.
So, Claire, thank you. We'll move on.
Okay, the next area, we're looking at the use of contracted evaluators. As we know, some tender processes require expertise above what we have in-house, but those external evaluators can also raise concerns about conflicts of interest and even scoring and such. So under what circumstances do you appoint external evaluators?
So we had external evaluators working on the ferry contract. So they tend to be the larger, more complex. It's not routinely used. We may bring in people with expertise to sit alongside the team, but I haven't used the word contracted evaluators until I saw it written down. So yesterday or whenever. So I'm not familiar with that term, apart from with the ferry contract we did have expert advice brought in.
The expert advice would be the external evaluator that assures
Yeah.
best value or due diligence or
Yeah.
such. So,
So
what,
they may-
what would you say is the threshold or complexity that triggers their use?
I think it's the complexity in terms of and expertise in particular areas where we may not have that specialist knowledge, that we would bring in an expert to support the process. We wouldn't contract out the whole of the process, in my experience. We would bring in people or person who has that experience to help guide and perhaps give some colour and more information for the team to make a decision.
And how do you ensure that these external advisors are appropriate and conflict-free?
Well, we'd run the usual checks on them, so making sure conflicts of interest, previous work, the usual things you do when you're bringing any external into the organisation. May have slightly different focus, but we'd run through, make sure that they were able and competent to do it and had no conflicts.
Okay. And how would you say is the consistency maintained when multiple evaluators are involved? Have you had any cases like that?
The way we set those up, is if it's a complex tender, you'd have different people working on different work streams, which would then be moderated at the end, and then there'd be a consensus. So it can be quite a complex process, and I'm thinking of one of the big complex IT projects we had for various elements. So knowledge of the software, knowledge of systems. We had people related. We had terms and conditions. So that again is a team effort with bringing in the expertise to make sure. And then also you've got your subject matter experts within the department. So if it's to do with a people services type system, you'd bring in people from the people services team to be part of that process. But it wouldn't just be a couple of people sitting in a room. It would be a team of people who, particularly on the more complex.
Because you mentioned before the ferry procurement involving external evaluators. What lessons would you say we learned from using them in this standard process?
Well, I thought it worked really well, actually.
I think it worked well having those external evaluators because they did come in for the exact reason they were called in, for their subject matter expertise. They brought that to the evaluation process that we undertook, both the Pan Island and the Jersey only one. So in my experience, it worked well using that skill set. Yeah.
And there is less opportunity for bias, even conscious or unconscious, if you're bringing in people who understand the service or the environment or the supply chain. There is some natural bias sometimes which creeps in, and having external can just challenge that a little bit.
Okay, and now a bit just more general, from the responses you've sent, we didn't have time to dive in details, but I can see that for 2023-2024, the departmental supplier spend for procure goods, services and works across the government was around 450 million, and from those, half were spent for on-island, about half for off-island. And we received the list of the on-island suppliers. Mm-hmm. Are you able to give examples of the most used from off-island, or to compile a list from us the same?
Yes, we can
What
do
sort
that.
of services were used off-island, and how in the future maybe we can find solutions to use for those kind of services more on-island?
Yes, so you're asking for a list of off-island?
Yes.
Okay.
And can you give now just 1, 2 examples of the biggest services that would have to be used off-island?
Well, currently there will be services provided to the new hospital facilities project. Those skill sets will be particularly around construction of hospital facilities. We don't necessarily have that specialist skill on island.
I think health.
Health, yes,
Health
of course.
generally.
What else? Because it's like, how many we spend off island on procurement?
Off-island, about half, 250 million.
250 and 240 million, so kind of.
So significant
Spend.
element will be health.
Okay.
Whether they're health supplies in the operating theatre, health supplies in terms of medicines.
It's all the tertiary
drugs,
care.
Tertiary
All the
care,
care
yes,
on
off-island
island,
tertiary
off-island.
care. But you will see tertiary care featuring in the top 10 on island as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so it would be useful if you could do similar
Well,
for
well,
the
So
follow up
we're
with
due
the-
to publish the top 100 suppliers, and that makes
May,
it clear which are on and
thank
off island.
And now we'll move
suppliers.
to the next part on feedback to unsuccessful tenders.
Sorry, could I just ask a follow-up question on
okay.
the evaluators? The question of bringing in external evaluators. So could I just confirm that you mentioned that you'd separated into different work streams, you'd have one set of people working on one work stream. So would one work stream represent, from the diagram you supplied overnight,
yeah.
just one of these lines on this
It
table
could
here?
be. Yeah, it could be.
Okay, so typically what you're saying is you wouldn't have different evaluators working on the same line.
You might have, it depends on the size of the project, you might have 2 or 3 working on each of the lines. Yeah.
But on separate aspects of each line.
Separate aspects. So if we were doing, you could have an evaluator or evaluators on separate lines. So you could have 2 or 3 on separate lines.
I understand, but you wouldn't have them working in competition with one another effectively. Okay, so you'd have the same evaluator working out the same element of each score. So you'd have a basic, okay.
Yeah.
So I guess the big question for us is that we understand that with the Guernsey ferry contract, we ended up in a situation where we had 2 sets of evaluations or scores, one performed by Jersey and one performed by Guernsey, and we came out with different totals. Each island came out with a different total. And I'm still scratching my head and trying to work out why in a well-designed tender process, you could end up with the same objective information providing different scores. If you have the same evaluators working on each aspect, each element of it, they should presumably come up to exactly the same total. Doesn't make sense to me.
Just thinking that.
Well, for the ferry, we had an evaluator in the Guernsey team and the Jersey team looking at a particular work stream effectively. So that's.
So you had separate evaluators in each island?
Yes.
Yeah, but working on each of the work streams.
So you had one evaluator for each island on each element of the work stream. So I guess the question needs to be repeated. What input did we take from procurement strategies elsewhere in the world where there have been separate organisations procuring the same product or service? It's a fairly fundamental feature that you would establish what your evaluation criteria and independent evaluators, the identity of your independent evaluators are in the first place.
I think there was. That's why we had independent people looking at this. So we had, was it KPM? KPMG?
Were Guernsey tied to the same evaluators?
Didn't evaluate first time, did they?
Sorry.
They were evaluators first time.
No. So there was separate evaluators in each island for each work stream, as I understand, with an evaluation criteria set out was in the ITT document that I'm sure you have seen. Yeah. So this comes down to individuals effectively.
So, can I clarify, KPMG were not in round 1
No,
as
they
an
weren't.
evaluator. They were in the
Round
Jersey only round as an evaluator.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, joint procurement strategies typically involve, especially high-value ones, or important ones, involve a single evaluator for each number that adds to the total. You can't have 2 different evaluators, otherwise you end up in exactly the situation that we're in right now.
So, I've got my own views. I'm not going to say where I think that happened. It gets into inter-island and different opinions relating to different entities.
It isn't. This is to do with the architecture of the process. This is purely procedural.
So, perhaps contracting in a single external advisor, a single external evaluator might have been, with hindsight, an approach to take, but only then if each of the awarding islands was going to go with that individual external evaluator's assessment.
But this is best practice from a number of recent examples across Europe.
I'll take your word for it.
Well, you shouldn't need to take my word for it. This should be
So-
something that's
so,
reasonably well known
advice
to
was-
commercial services, for example.
Yeah,
For
advice was taken. That was professional advice. It's entirely possible that different islands can come up with different conclusions, and that's the way it was ultimately designed.
I can give
views
examples
as to
of.
why that, how that has happened.
Can you give any examples of where such an approach has been successful in the past?
We haven't done.
How's the air ambulance done?
Their ambulance is still in process.
Right. So, but it has been done in the past.
It has, but that was a while ago, Richard. I wouldn't.
Okay, so is it an example of a
It could be.
joint island?
It is. It's. We've got one. I'm going to use a pun here. It is in flight, so we have a procurement process in flight to jointly award the air ambulance service, which is currently in the tender process, and therefore I can't give you any more details than that because it's in flight.
I understand. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to be quick. If I put in a tender and don't get it, what happens? What do I get back from the department or from the central team?
Yeah, so we invite any unsuccessful tenders for a debrief, which we have with the supplier or the unsuccessful suppliers. We will give them honest, constructive feedback supported by evidence such as scoring, and we will identify where they did well and where they could have done better.
Okay, and is that the same whether it's a small contract or a big contract?
Yes, it should be.
Okay, and if I appeal, can I appeal against your decision?
You can raise a concern, but it depends where we are in the process. So, we're generally given feedback once we've picked the supplier. So, I suppose the hard answer is no, but you can definitely give us feedback, and if it was a very strong concern, then I suppose we would seek legal advice as to whether that was worthy of consideration.
So feedback can go both ways.
Of course.
And if I give the advice for the unsuccessful supplier and I think I've been badly treated and I say so, is that going to affect my future possibilities for winning work? Is it going to be held against me?
Well, no.
Thank you. Now we can move on now.
Yeah.
Okay. The question subject area is future plans for procurement thresholds. I noticed that you've answered quite a lot of the questions that we were planning to ask in the document you sent overnight, which I received at about 10 o'clock this morning, so haven't had a chance to go through it in a huge amount of detail. A couple of things I noticed were that as we understand it at present, although it's not been confirmed, one of the proposed thresholds is to raise the £25,000 threshold to £75,000 on the basis that it's been fixed since 2006, since which time there's been an 83% increase in RPI according to your document, which means roughly a doubling of it, not a tripling of it. And I was just wondering what the thought process was behind that.
Yeah, so we have the 75. I don't know where that's come from actually, because we're still working through. There's been a piece of work done, a very detailed piece of work by the team, with input from various internal parts of the organisation, and we're still working through that. I don't know where the 75 has come from, and we're still, as I say, we're still working through what those thresholds may be. So currently we're working with the current thresholds. There is a very, very detailed piece of work which we need to kind of sense check in the real world in terms of, and there's some work being done in terms of what if we were to reduce it, for example, to the lower threshold is, if we brought the threshold down from 25,000 to 10, for example, what would be the impact? Now, the impact may be, and we haven't done this piece of work, it may be that, and we do that across the board, it may be that local suppliers, when we get some of this feedback, is they find it onerous to bid for work because our tender thresholds require lots and lots of information, big documents. That may unlock more opportunities for local suppliers. So we're just doing a bit more work on what's already been a very thorough piece of work from my team. Great. But we haven't
I understand
agreed
that.
yet.
Are you consulting in that case with local businesses on these thresholds?
That's potentially our next step, because obviously we're doing it theoretically. And my comment around, local businesses might want to do this, I haven't tested that yet with the local businesses. They might go, we're not interested in, under 10,000, or whatever it might be.
Understood. To what extent are you employing or contemplating employing AI for procurement processes?
Oh, that would be good, wouldn't it? Interestingly enough, we haven't got any firm written down plans yet, but some of the team are using it for some of their analysis, and we're using it alongside what I call traditional methods, but not discounting it at all.
Okay. Are you using it at all or contemplating its use in terms of fraud and circumvention detection?
That's probably a very good area for it to be used, but I haven't got any substance in that. I'm just going on what I think.
Okay.
Seems to be the way it's going, and certainly in all the literature around procurement and commercial, there is reference to the use of AI in those circumstances. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And just one related question, which I think actually applies to government as a whole, which is that we've been through a period of high inflation. We're in higher than recent years inflation, certainly even now. How do you factor inflation into, I noticed, for example, that the vast majority by value of breaches, for example, in digital in particular, have been to do with contract variations of greater than 10% that haven't gone through the appropriate procedures. Some of this may be to do with inflation. Some of this may be to do with genuine productivity reductions, and I think that's the point that applies across all of government. How are you disentangling inflation from productivity?
I think that's something that we, certainly through the thresholds and certainly through the piece of what you've mentioned, that's something that we need to consider. I'm not actively considering it just now, but it's certainly, we've got people in the team, economics team, who can help us do that.
Okay, thank you.
How generally you make a decision what needs to be delivered within the government, like within the states of Jersey, government of Jersey as a service, and what needs to be outsourced? Is it any guidance? So how the decision is made,
Do you
what to
mean
outsource and what to have to do in-house?
So outsourcing services.
Service, to procure services or to deliver this in-house?
So that really comes down to the initial part when we're looking at the procurement strategy. So starting, when you're setting out to decide whether it's a make or buy decision, which is what you would look at all the factors and decide whether it's better to do it in-house or whether there's a market and whether there's an appetite for and would it make sense to outsource. Okay. So it's on a case-by-case basis.
Are there any circumstances in which you would make a decision to make, rather than buy a service, in direct competition with the local market? If, for example, you felt that there were super profits available, or it was something that you could achieve very substantial cost savings, even though it may be harmful to the local market, to local providers.
So that tension is one, for example, would be professional services. So we currently have a high reliance upon professional services contracts with local suppliers and off-island suppliers. Often that's driven by either lack of capability or capacity, more often both together, in terms of certain skill sets. So we have it in procurement specialists, but we might have it in, we do have it in programme management, for example, and in certain skills required by M&D. We know that if we were able to hire them directly, we would more likely than not achieve a cost saving. But we have significant challenges to be able to recruit them. So then you have to get into strategy of growing your own as it is creating your own market. That might be something we're looking
Yes,
to do
that's
in
what I'm
terms of procurement specialisms, and it was something we're actively looking to do on programme management, for example.
Okay, so those are specialist professional skills. What about something more sort of generic, something like, for example, recruitment skills for just ordinary general staff, general headcount?
So, firstly, we will use agencies to recruit. Sometimes that will relate to whatever the specific role is and whether you're needing to access markets that your in-house team can't necessarily access as easily. You might have jobs that are difficult to recruit to, and therefore you would use specialists in that particular area where your economies of scale say it's not worth your while for the number of recruitments you have to build your own team in, for example, to headhunt international tax specialists.
Okay, so for off-island people, on-island people?
On-island people, not. Probably mostly direct recruitment.
You do that directly already
Yeah.
anyway. Okay, thank you.
Question around social values. When thinking of supplying examples of the procurement strategies, and we've seen the difference that some contracts have 5%, some contracts have 10%, so it's not consistent. I would like to understand how you determine or the level of the social value for particular procurement.
So in the response, actually, we've just set it at 10%. So it was 10% for all social value.
I mean, the procurement strategies that you supplied to the
No, it
PAC,
yeah,
which
no,
was this year, we have 5 and 10 in
yeah,
different.
but it's now 10.
So it from now on
Ten.
will be flat 10.
Default is 10.
Yeah.
Unless someone comes up with a very good case for it not
To be, yeah.
So what can be the case? Not to be 10.
Our answer says that there might be a good argument made. I'm not.
Just an example.
Flexibility, I'm not really inclined to say that there would be.
I'm just trying to think if I've got an example, but not off the top of my head. We think 10% is a reasonable proportionate out of the other 90 points that are available.
No, my question was because we've seen different procurement strategies and contracts for small contracts, not
Yes,
big contracts. Not
but
we're talking.
we've clarified that, so it's
Okay.
10.
And still regarding to the social value policies, how is that communicated to suppliers? Is the tender document clearly outlining the scoring and outlines that expectation?
Yes. Yeah. And it will vary depending on the goods and services that are being provided, won't it?
Would the local suppliers receive extra points for being local suppliers and paying actually into the system as a social value contribution?
Not directly, but potentially indirectly.
What does it mean?
Well, so the economic value of them being on island will be brought into perhaps some of the other scoring, the other 90 points.
Would you have a special line to actually get extra 1-2 points, whatever it is, for their scoring to raise their contribution into the income of the...
I think that most likely would be covered in the social value 10%. For example, we might be looking at apprentices and people employed back to work effectively, and that is one of the lines in the social value.
No, what I'm talking about, when you rewrote the contract to people, it's not necessarily apprentice. I understand the apprentice's social value, but the people, this particular local company will pay to the employers, and they will pay taxes, which we will see in annual reports and accounts coming as an income. When we will pay to the UK-based companies, the taxes will go to the UK. So the contribution, the public funds will not come back to the public use. So would the local companies, would they have a line to get extra points that as their contribution to the island economy?
I wouldn't see it as an extra line. I'd see it as part of their bid, their overall bid.
Okay.
Yeah. So the quality of their bid it would come through in that as opposed to a particular percentage.
How would it be scored, though? I mean, so supposing we have a vanilla contract, I don't know what it might be. It could, for example, even be the travel contract, the corporate travel contract that you guys have. It could be a local agency over here, and it could be a UK or further afield agency for a similar sort of value. And they both come in. What would it be? You know, they score identically on every other point, save for one is on island and one is off island. And then values are variable. What variation in value would cause you to appoint it to the local company over the mainland company or non-island company? What's that variable there? That's what, you know.
I think we'd have to take that. I think at the currently as it stands, we don't have a positive weighting for on island. However, that's not to say we're not looking at it. And part of the reason we haven't is because we're under the World Trade Organization and a number of other bodies, which I think you will have seen in the pack. We are just looking towards the UK, actually, the Cabinet Office have a new way of incorporating objectivity into enabling economic value to come through if it's on island. So we can actually target and have particular procurements which are for on island only. But we're just at the very beginnings of that. As you can probably tell, I'm not very polished on how I've just described that. But
Okay.
And on
So
that,
sorry, if I could just ask one quick question. There have always been thresholds under the WTO rules, which are the ones that flow through into all of the other trade regulations. What are the current thresholds below which you don't need to consider off-island bids by law?
well, here
Well, for the UK, because we follow the UK, I guess.
we follow the UK, but it's not just the value.
So there are no value thresholds for where procurement routes are prescribed by law,
Yes, there are, and we have our own.
separate from the and what are our thresholds then?
So 100,000.
100,000 by law.
Yes.
Okay, and
But that's not about letting to local entities.
No,
though.
no.
That's for
just general
thresholds for
anything.
tender.
okay,
Tender.
no, I'm
That's
asking
not
about
the
the
question.
yeah, I'm asking for the local versus non-local thresholds.
We
There are
we don't
non-current.
have local, non-local.
What are the ones that we're obliged to follow under the WTO rules?
That's, I can't remember the values. Can you? Paul?
No, I can't. So that is to do with not giving preferential treatment effectively.
Yes, that's right. So do you remember? Do you know what those thresholds are?
And off the top of my head, I don't know.
So when you give consideration to the use of local contracts as opposed to non-local contracts, will you be having regard to those thresholds and making sure that as many contracts as possible can be made on island subject to those thresholds?
We will look at that.
Okay, thank you.
and because you mentioned just want to clarify that, because you mentioned the UK, how closely the procurement guidelines are following the external best practices, like from the UK National Audit Office or Crown Commercial Services? Are those incorporated in our practices in procurement?
They are broadly, yes. So the thresholds, tendering process is very similar. We do have a bit more flexibility. The Cabinet Office are just rewriting theirs based on not being part of Brexit, which has taken a while. I'm reviewing those. I'm also reviewing the National Audit Office recommendations. But we're looking at both of those at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Philip, yeah.
I've got one off-piste question.
Fine,
Okay.
yeah.
And to what extent do you get involved on the procurement activities of arm's length organisations? If we say the Financial Services Commission, for example, or Jersey Telecom, or what, do they consult you? Do you get involved in what their activities are? This is background information?
Yeah. No,
Okay,
So they're doing their own
they
procurement.
do their
Yeah.
own.
they do their own thing.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anything else from you?
And just the last part, do you conduct structured post-procurement value for money reviews? And can you share any important lesson learned that you came across doing that?
I think we can, you're asking for some information back, yeah.
Like, do you do some sort of reviews after post-procurement for value for money? And have you had any important lesson learned doing that?
We do have some lessons learned, yeah. We don't always, the problem, well, not problem, but the way we're structured is we don't necessarily see all of the procurements that are happening and know exactly how they've gone or what's gone well or what hasn't gone well. We tend to know the ones haven't gone well or where we've had to give advice, or the ones that have gone well or just been, it's been a reasonable job, everything's been delivered. And so we tend to only to get involved in the ones which perhaps didn't go so well. But that's largely down to resource, I would say.
Any more urgent questions from anyone? Thank you for, so we 5 minutes above. Thank you very, very much. And thank you for your answers and thank you for your time. And we are looking forward for the development of the procurement practices. As you said, there's lots of work in progress.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And public
Thank
hearing
you.
is closed.
Thanks.
Thank you.